Hello and welcome to tonight's Commonwealth Club World Affairs program. My name is Rachel Myro, Senior Editor of KQED's Silicon Valley News Desk. Before we get started, a few reminders. Tonight's program is being recorded, so we kindly ask that you silence your cell phones for the duration of our program. Also, if you have any questions for our guest speaker, please fill out the little cards that were on your seats, or if you're joining us online through the YouTube chat, and I'll remind you all that we're coming up on the Q&A period shortly before we do. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's special guest, Theo Baker, author of How to Rule the World and Education in Power at Stanford University. As an undergraduate at Stanford, Theo uncovered allegations of research misconduct by university president Mark Tessier-Lavigne. This led to stakeouts, confidential sources, and pitched battles with university attorneys and PR teams hired to undermine his reporting. In the end, President Tessier-Lavigne was forced to resign. Theo's groundbreaking investigative journalism led him to become the youngest ever recipient of the prestigious George Polk Award. And in a few weeks,
Thank you.
in a few weeks, Theo will be graduating.
Knock on wood. Knock on wood.
No doubt. Theo, welcome and congratulations on your new book.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So why don't we start off by talking about said book? You arrived at Stanford at 17, intending to climb the Silicon Valley ladder, like I imagine most everybody else at Stanford. By the end of freshman year, you brought down the university president. What changed in you that you decided to fight the corruption rather than just play along?
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you to those of you who have joined us here and spend your Wednesday night here at the Commonwealth Club, a wonderful place to be. So excited to get to talk about the book. That's right. I showed up at Stanford thinking I was going to be a coder. I am still, I guess, to some degree, a true believer in technology. I was the kind of kid who would, code machine learning models in my bedroom in high school. And I had been in love with Stanford for really the greater part of my life by the time I arrived here. I showed up and I very quickly realized that, things didn't work exactly as I thought they might. That, within a few weeks at Stanford, I was at a mansion party in the hills funded by a slush fund that funneled corporate cash into the pockets of teenagers. And everything was a little bit strange, because what is this world? What is this place where teenagers are the hot commodity to be mined? At the same time, I became a sort of accidental investigative journalist over the course of the year. And the book, is many things, but I do hope that it is in part a love letter to journalism. I discovered, as you know, and other professional journalists know far better than I do, what an incredible thing it is to be able to just dig up the answers to questions you want to know, and to be in the position where, as a 17-year-old and 18-year-old, you can, directly determine whether or not things will be known to your community that I felt were important to be known. And so the book is also partially that sort of descent into journalism.
That's a good way of putting it, descent into journalism. We'll talk about that momentarily. But, for the benefit of people who might be unfamiliar with Mark Tessier-Lavigne, he is a superstar neuroscientist, a very wealthy biotech executive. He was forced to resign as a direct result of your reporting. And I think everyone in this room grasps what an amazing, impressive thing you did there, even if you weren't just a kid. I mean, it really was an ace in the hole. But 6 months after resigning, Tessier-Lavigne landed $1 billion for his next venture. He got a large settlement. I believe he's living in a mansion now. What does that tell you about the lack of accountability at Stanford in particular and Silicon Valley more broadly?
Yeah. Well, this is the very kicker of the book, the very end of the book. Mark Tessier-Lavigne, and this is reported for the first time in the book, was ousted unanimously by his own board of trustees. 6 months later, he raises the largest seed round in the history of biotech. $1 billion for his new firm. And he's riding this sort of tidal wave of funding for anything AI at the moment. His company is using AI for developing drugs. This is also part of the story, right? AI. I arrived on campus only 2 months before ChatGPT did. And it's been a pretty interesting time to go to college, right? That if AI is expected to shape every industry in a new and different way, higher education is one of the first to be, subject to that. Because what is an easier way to get an A than by using, chat on your phone? People call it chat now, which I think is so fascinating, that this word that people have used, for years now to describe the anonymous online chat function of a Twitch live stream while you're playing a video game and you're asking it what to do. That's now how we refer to chat, because what really is the difference between sort of the online faceless, nameless person you will never meet in your life and a statistical approximation of the same thing that you're now sort of handing over much of your life to. What Mark Tessier-Lavigne did was ride that sort of tidal wave of AI funding that many of the same people that you see in the book that I arrived with as students ultimately also profit off of. The guy who teaches me how to shotgun a beer freshman year drops out 6 months after he starts his AI company. It's valued at over $1 billion, which is more than $80 million per employee of the company, by the way, run by the 22-year-old.
It's mind-blowing. It certainly wasn't my experience in college. The book title, How to Rule the World, is not a metaphor, heads up. It's the name of a class that teaches a select cohort of 12 students how to extract value from people. How did you find out about it?
So that's right. How to Rule the World, not just a metaphor. It's a secret class at Stanford. When I arrived, it was actually sort of the ultimate representation of the insider world, that even knowing about it was sort of a status signifier. You were, quote unquote, rule adjacent, in what I thought was a delicious phrase passed on by one of the people I spoke with. I was referred to, quote unquote, rule. That's how kids talk about it, rule. I was referred for an interview for the class early on in freshman year, when I was still there as sort of a nascent coder and hadn't quite become a journalist. By the time I sat down for my interview, I had already sort of, going back to that word, descended into student journalism, and I was not allowed to join the class myself. But being just close enough to see that it existed, I was able to report on it over the course of the next few years and to collect accounts from people in this secret seminar, which is something like a skull and bones for the aspiring tech elite, right? This is where the kids who are the most ambitious, the most exceptional go, because they want to learn the secrets of the billionaires they aspire to become. It's where people like Phoebe Gates was in it, daughter of Bill and Melinda. It's where they're taught how to, quote unquote, extract value from people, how to exceed the limits of their conceivable ambition. And in so many ways, I think this is a great representation of what kids are being taught at Stanford, right? Which is that you, as the 17 and 18-year-old, you are the resource to mine. You can be monetized to an extraordinary degree, and getting ahead at all costs is the way to succeed in this system.
So you're tapped on the shoulder, but they discover, or perhaps they just knew when they researched you, that you were descending into journalism. Is that why you were barred from the class?
Yeah, I've asked Justin. I would love to know more. Justin is the Silicon Valley CEO who has styled himself as a professor. Should be noted, this is not an official course in the sense of earning course credit. There's nothing about it in the course catalog. There was, up until about, I guess, a few weeks ago, nothing about it you could learn on the internet. And this was, I ended up having my interview for the very same week that I broke the first story about Mark Tessier-Lavigne. That came up during the interview, so it was certainly clear that I was, at that point, becoming a journalist. I think I and others have suspicions about, why I might not be qualified for the How to Rule the World class, but ultimately, I think that was a great thing, that it allowed me to be just sort of close enough to see what was happening and to report on this for the book. Ultimately, I spoke with 7 people who were part of this class, and what they told me, right, is that in their view, what Justin is doing is sort of a scam. That actually, he's trying to do what everyone is trying to do, and network with teenagers who are going to be useful to him in the future. He doesn't really know how to rule the world, or maybe he does, but that's not the point. The point is the networking. Only he has figured out this sort of brilliant scheme to make the kids who really do want to learn how to rule the world come to him.
You write about students identified early as potential unicorn founders who get access to a Stanford within Stanford, secret societies, yacht parties, shell companies, pre-funding. Let me just reiterate, pre-idea funding people. How does one get plucked for that?
Well, that's the thing. It's necessarily opaque. Now that Stanford has this association with entrepreneurship, and so many people come to the university thinking they can be the next techno-Jesus, right? There has to be a way to sort the wheat from the chaff, or in the words of one of the investors I spoke with, the quote-unquote wantapreneurs from the quote-unquote builders, right? That's a really valuable exercise for these people, because if you're just funding someone who wants to be a CEO because they want to be rich, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be a good entrepreneur. And so the entry points to the Stanford inside Stanford are kept purposefully disguised. Mostly, though Silicon Valley preaches meritocracy as sort of the end-all be-all, mostly it's who you know. Are you being tapped on the shoulder by one of the right people? That could be the talent scouts that some of the venture capitalists literally employ on campus to identify freshmen as soon as they arrive. That could be a CEO who reaches out to you cold. There was one CEO who reached out to me, who started a billion-dollar company, reached out to me freshman year, takes me out for brunch at the Rosewood, which markets itself as the modern clubhouse for Silicon Valley. I love that phrase.
They do make a good burger.
They do make a good burger, and he wasn't having the burger. He was sitting there with his 8-month-old son on his lap, spoon-feeding his 8-month-old caviar, as he confessed, without apparent shame, that his first ever contract was for Muammar Gaddafi, the Libyan dictator. And this was sort of an outrageous and ridiculous and absurd scene in so many ways, until it wasn't. Right, because as he explained, my job, right, is running a company, he says, but my secret job is finding interesting people. And that's the calculus. If Silicon Valley has been the greatest concentration and creation of wealth in human history, by some metrics in the last few decades, the resource to mine is talent. And the earlier you find it, the more you can make your own career.
But as you say, this is not really about meritocracy. So if it's not talent, then is it... an early propensity for psychopathy, or what exactly is it that they're screening the kids for? Perhaps it is that they know that they're the children of somebody who's got power and money already?
Sometimes. I think most of it is about self-presentation, right? And that is sort of the overriding theme of the book, is appearance über alles. It's both the first line of the first chapter and the last line of the last chapter are the same. Stanford is supposed to look perfect. And I think a lot could be explained by that sort of very simple maxim that, as one professor put it to me, we have a culture of overclaiming the good results, right? We blow up things more here than we would elsewhere, and we sweep the bad things under the rug and don't talk about them. So the kids who learn how to say the right things, how to use the right buzzwords, how to network with the right people, for them, you could be taken out by different venture capitalists for dinner every night of the week for a full year without much of an issue. And that's not the normal experience most people have at Stanford, right? This is necessarily a cloistered world, a small insider segment, but it is the logical end result of what Stanford is. It's no accident that this exists at Stanford. It is inculcated by the sort of Faustian bargain that the university has made with Silicon Valley.
What do you say to critics who say you're building your career in journalism with a takedown of a very tiny subset of Stanford, that this really isn't the larger story?
Well, there are a lot of different stories in the book, right? I write about the Stanford president and the half-dozen studies that were retracted as a result of my reporting. I write about Stanford's so-called war on fun and social life and what it actually means to be a college student today. I write about this guy who pretends to be a student for a year and fits in, and Stanford never warns anybody despite knowing about him for a year. So there are a lot of different parts of the book. Certainly, this is a small segment of Stanford, absolutely. And yet it is indicative of something about the broader institution, about the lack of accountability and transparency. One of the stories I reported on freshman year that I find very sort of illustrative is about this guy named Stan Cohen. Stan Cohen, this living legend in genetics. He was the first geneticist to transplant genes from one living organism to another. His invention with regard to DNA, recombinant DNA, resulted by the last year of its operation in 62% of Stanford's patent revenue. Right, so hundreds of millions of dollars he made the university. This really, BFD, big deal. And this guy, I discovered during my freshman year, had been found liable in a court of law for fraud. He was levied with a $29.2 million judgment and forced to pay out that restitution because he told investors that he was working on this company which professed that it would have a cure for Huntington's disease. Not just a treatment, but a cure is what the company document said. Not only that, he had this great drug target that had been approved for treating a different condition already. So they could elide the need for preclinical toxicology studies that would otherwise take years and cost millions of dollars. He neglected to mention that the study, that this drug that he was targeting had been permanently banned by the FDA in 1976 because it could kill people. Right? So he left that part out when he was getting the investment. So I go to Stanford about this professor in this court case. I say, hey, can you comment on this? I forget the exact questions I asked, but something along those lines. And Stanford says, we had nothing to do with this. We've never heard of this court case. We can't say anything, won't respond to any questions about repercussions or whatnot. Well, that was nonsense. If you look at the court record, Stanford owns the IP at issue. Not only that, Stanford was subpoenaed in the court case. They fought the subpoena, and then they ultimately had to provide documents and witnesses. This professor, who also gave false testimony on the stand, by the way, not only eventually admitted to neglecting to inform the investors about this key fact about the drug, but he also admitted to potential violations of Stanford policy. He was cheating on his wife as she lay dying of cancer, and he appointed his paramour to lucrative positions in both his Stanford lab and his company without disclosure. Right? So all of these things you might think that Stanford would address in some way or another. To this day, Stanford cites Stan Cohen's research in press releases about the school's research apparatus as why it's so great, while neglecting to address the misconduct that emerged from the very same lab. And so that's kind of what I'm writing about, right? You can't only have the good and never talk about the bad. Elizabeth Holmes is just as much a product of Stanford University as Hewlett or Packard.
You use the phrase, just a little bit of fraud, to describe the ambient moral atmosphere of Stanford. Just a little bit, or moral rot from tip to toe?
Well, this is a phrase that comes from a colleague of mine while we were working on the school hackathon freshman year. And this was how I ended up seeing a lot of the inside Stanford stuff I describe in the book. TreeHacks is vested with hundreds of thousands of dollars from corporate sponsors and zero contracts or oversight whatsoever. And, inevitable mishigas results from that. My colleague and I were discussing this, and she said, well, it's all just a little bit of fraud. And I think that really captures something about how this ecosystem works. There's a very thin line between acceptable reality distortion field and unacceptable fraudulent misrepresentation. And even, I feel like as journalists, we think of Reddit as one of the better social media companies. Reddit faked all their user data for the first 2 years of the company. That's what the founders admitted. And nobody ever talks about that because they won, right? Winning is what matters. And if you don't win, that's when the problems arise. So this is all sort of part and parcel of a system that does not have a culture of robust accountability, that when things start to go wrong, and I saw this with the kids I arrived in freshman year. They learn that they can misrepresent themselves to VCs and raise money. They learn, one of my friends at the time, I watched her fake a launch demo for this splashy new company, and she gets feted by all of Silicon Valley, and suddenly she's put up in a mansion, and her technology cannot do what she says it can, right? And so if you want to understand how this fraud results, I think it's so interesting that the very day that this book was announced in the fall, I've been working on this for years, we finally announced it in the fall. That very same day, Do Kwon, the Stanford alum whose company he at first imagined while at the school, he was sentenced to 15 years in prison for his role in a multi-billion-dollar crypto fraud, right? There's a reason that these frauds keep emerging, and it's not just because of a few bad apples. It's because the incentive structures have gone awry.
What kind of reaction have you received from, I don't know, your colleagues on campus, as it were? Maybe not your close friends, but people passing by. Do they recognize your face? Do they call out, or do they threaten you?
Look, I think there's a real recognition by a lot of people that the way that the system is functioning right now doesn't work. And I heard this from people throughout my reporting, including John Hennessy, a former president of Stanford from 2000 to 2015. Mark Andreessen calls him the godfather of Silicon Valley. And he is the one who ushered in so much of this no borders relationship that characterizes the university today.
Gives a different meaning to the word godfather, doesn't it?
It's, a double-edged sword there. And, even what Hennessy says is, look, we live in this system which we help to create, and it's very hard to separate that out. That sure, hundreds of people on this campus think that they will build the next great AI company. Maybe one of them will, but not hundreds. And Stanford has done a very, very good job of creating this mythology around itself. But it's a mythology that hides a lot of how the sausage actually gets made.
Some of the people who read this book, I imagine, are going to feel some envy for the young Turks you describe who are plied with money and drugs and, apparently a golden ticket, like they're going to be allowed to fail up. Do you want readers to feel envy, pity, compassion, fear, some combination thereof?
Well, I want people to have their own takeaways, and I think there are different reasonable reactions to, what I report in the book. I do think that in addition to all of that being true, and there's an immense amount of privilege, being on display here in just sort of a hyper-concentrated form, there's also a large amount of exploitation too. That, it's sort of hard to imagine, but what happens when you give an 18-year-old, $1 million and say, hey, build something with it, and if you don't, your career is over. That, you should drop out at 18 or 19 years old and stake yourself on something because it's the path of least resistance now. I speak to people in the book who talk about how hard it is, to sort of resist the golden handcuffs, before you are even graduating age. You're being offered the opportunity to establish, generational wealth potentially for yourself and your family. And that, that incentive structure can be incredibly perverse because the people who are offering that money are doing it because they want to make money off of you. And they don't really care, many times whether you succeed or you don't, because you're just one of many bets for them, right? They don't care if they have to cycle through a bunch of teenagers, because teenagers, relatively speaking, are cheap to them, right? It doesn't cost as much to fund a teenager as it does to fund a 30-year-old entrepreneur. And, if just one of them works out, you've made your career. So the perverse incentive structures, I think, are fascinating to watch.
Am I right in thinking your book has been optioned for a movie? Which led me to think about the movie Wall Street, of course, and that famous line, right? Greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Do you worry your work will entice rather than repel a new generation of strivers?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly a hard question to reckon with. We've seen this happen. I think about, The Social Network, or, there are kids I describe in the book who are coding their startups, listening to the soundtrack to The Social Network because they want to be like the characters. And I think they're kind of missing the point, but, are they? I mean, I guess Mark Zuckerberg did end up very wealthy, and so did Eduardo Saverin for that matter. I don't know. I don't know how people will take it. I try to divest myself from that as much as I can. I think as journalists, you have more experience with this than I do, but I think it's important to try to not be invested in the outcomes and to focus on telling the story as thoroughly and comprehensively as you can. I will say that, if nothing else, I'm grateful that this reporting has resulted in, I think, increased awareness of some issues around scientific misconduct, that, the incentive structures there, publish or perish, that academic model where if you don't get a paper in one of these big journals, your career won't exist. That incentive structure, which is the word that I keep coming back to, I guess, in this talk, is very flawed. And I do hope that this work has helped bring some attention to that, as well as resulting in, I think, the, contribution to the scientific record in terms of these purged papers no longer being on the books.
We talked about this earlier, but reading this book, I kept thinking about another book that I read for the Commonwealth Club, Doctored, Charles Pillar's takedown of fraud in Alzheimer's research. Yeah. So, related. Same forensic toolkit, same diagnosis, same Elizabeth Bick, the microbiologist and scientific sleuth, among others. It does seem like what's required so much today to point out dishonesty is an outsider who is on the inside.
Well, it's interesting, right? Charles Pillar is a great investigative journalist for science. He relied on a lot of the same forensic image analysts that I did, although he did significantly more work on this issue than I have, since my research misconduct reporting has primarily focused on one man, Mark Tessier-Levine. Charles Piller has shown how the entire field of Alzheimer's research has been beset by these issues, and he relied on several figures that I also worked with, Elizabeth Bick, Matthew Schrag, and others. These are sort of sleuths. They're fraud-spotting scientists who have dedicated their lives to purging the scientific record of misconduct. The work they do is very impressive. It's very difficult, I think, for the outsider, myself included, to understand how they identify these figures that have been spliced and manipulated and duplicated and photoshopped and moved around to portray results in a false fashion. I would say that the research misconduct aspect of this story is very much tied into the other elements of the story when it comes to how people learn, to cut corners on their way to the top.
Before there was AI, there was cryptocurrency. Before that, social media. I start to feel, certainly having read this book, that there isn't an argument to make to your classmates that they shouldn't hustle now to get in on the gravy train at all costs.
Well, look, AI is this great accelerant. It takes all the trends that have been brimming beneath the surface and it makes them far more magnified. And especially so when it comes to that stratification. The most valuable researchers are more valuable now than ever before. That's why Mark Zuckerberg is going to pay $14 billion effectively just to get Alexander Wang as his new head of AI. There's a common refrain, though, now among the Stanford inside Stanford, that it's easier to get funding for a startup than it is to get an internship. Right? So the most valuable people are more valuable than ever before. But the starter positions are being drawn up. The ladder is being drawn up in front of this next generation. Stanford, for the first time in over 2 decades, saw its computer science enrollment go down last year, which I think is really telling, right? Because AI, the resources that are being allocated toward it are distributed in a fabulously inequitable manner. And some people know that if they say the right words, they don't even have to have their own proprietary AI. They can work on a wrapper startup, right, that takes, an AI model that was developed by someone else and repackages it, and it can be valued at billions of dollars without, too many questions being thrown their way.
Oy. AI has accelerated cheating, corner cutting, self-presentation over substance, and, obviously not just at Stanford. But, you make a point to say we cheat ourselves when we let it do the thinking for us. Why is that?
Well, I think that's especially true in education, right? Because, look, a robot has, for many years, been able to lift 600 pounds a lot easier than I can, but that doesn't much help me if I'm trying to work out. And I think there's something similar there to AI in education. There are ways for it to be a productive and useful tool, but if you're outsourcing all of your thinking to it, there's already some emerging quantitative research or empirical research to back that people who use AI for cognitive tasks have less cognitive resilience when it comes to those same sort of intellectual labor. Look, the classroom, this is the thing that Stanford, I think, really struggles with is what does it actually mean? What's the point? What is the point of going to Stanford? Is this a place to get an education, or is it a place to get rich? And if you think about it from the latter point of view, it actually makes total sense that you would cheat on all your coursework and use AI to do it, because that's the point of you being there. The point of you being there is all the associated add-on effects. And so that's where AI is accelerating a trend that was already present at the university before. Stanford, in that sense, is really sort of the vanguard for a trend that is sweeping higher education. In the same way that Silicon Valley, you see these trends that filter out into the rest of society, Stanford often functions in the same sense as sort of a training ground for the next generation of higher ed and university leaders.
A family member recently graduated from university, did some A/B testing, would send in a paper he had actually written to professors, and then he would try sending in an AI paper, and consistently, the AI paper got the better grade, which says, right, the problem isn't just with the students.
Yeah, no, of course. And schools were very slow, I think, to recognize just how wholesale of a transformation this was. It's been a really weird time to be on college campuses, right? So my class of 2026, 2 months after we arrived, ChatGPT came out, and that changed everything. And the next year was post-October 7th, which changed everything again, the most divisive college protests, in decades. Junior year was an unprecedented federal assault on research funding and higher education. Now in senior year, we're graduating into a very tumultuous job market and whatnot. It might seem like these are sort of disconnected issues, that higher ed is under attack from all sides and that these are, just a really terrible set of coincidences. But all of these issues strike at the same central problem, which is that universities have forgotten what they are. Right? Stanford still likes to think of itself as an underdog, a regional institution it once was, where outsiders and renegades built the future just because they wanted to. It's not an underdog anymore. It's a place that is so sprawling that it has a budget higher than 116 countries. 116 countries, right? And so this is a giant, huge institution that is at the same time a hedge fund controlling billions of dollars. It is the site for ordinary coming of age and teenage exploration. It is a repository of historical thought and knowledge. It is a science lab on steroids. It is an engineering wing with huge commercial ramifications. It's a professional sports league. It's a merchandising opportunity. It's a hospital system. It is all of these things, and it says it is one thing, right? And that is a really big problem because these are at tension with one another. Universities no longer have a cohesive identity. And I think that's why we've seen so much trouble in the last few years, is that universities themselves don't know what they are.
So I don't know if you read the New York Times, but, there were a couple articles about the Pope's recent encyclical on AI. One of them was sort of announcing the thing itself, the arguments it's making, and then another article about the various people in Silicon Valley laughing at it, dismissing it out of hand. I'm curious if your friends and colleagues on the Stanford campus paid any attention, what their reactions were?
No, that's a great question. I don't think, I haven't worked through all 40,000 words yet, so I'm maybe not qualified to comment on its content. I think, it's really difficult to ask people to engage with criticism from the outside. That's not unique to Silicon Valley, right? It's really hard to ask people to reckon with, others' opinions on something that they aren't a part of. And I think that sort of defensive crouch that Silicon Valley has occupied in recent years is a harmful one, right? This book is not written from the perspective of someone who hates technology or who hates Stanford. I wouldn't be graduating from there next month, and I wouldn't have written this as a student if I didn't still care about this institution and want it to succeed. But there are problems that are brewing here, deep ones that are embedded in the very makeup and composition of how we have designed our institutions. If we fail to reckon with those, that comes back to haunt us, right? Nobody else is going to come crashing down, except for maybe the wider economy, if we fail. It comes back to our own priorities. And so if you love something, you want it to be better. You have to confront the issues. I like to say that tech is awesome and fraud is bad, right? That you can inculcate innovation without enabling, the Elizabeth Holmeses of the world to run amok. There will always be bad actors. There doesn't have to be a system that enables them.
Let's do a little thought experiment. Instead of attending this year's Stanford graduation ceremony, imagine that you're speaking before it. What would you say about AI and its impact on young graduates being dumped into the choppy waters of this job market without a paddle?
God, I don't know. It's, I have a friend, one of my friends who works at Anthropic, graduated just a few years ago, I think 3 years ago now. And he came back to give a campus lecture at a class, maybe 150 students recently. He's a really talented engineer. He is a role model in so many ways for a great Stanford avatar. And the only thing that people really wanted to ask him about is, what do we do? What do we do about AI? What do we do when we graduate? And he said, I have no idea. If I were in your shoes, I would have no idea what to do. This is a guy who graduated 3 years ago. That's how quickly everything has changed. And the numbers, I know we all live here, right? And I think we all understand this, but the numbers are still crazy, right? When I started freshman year at Stanford, Jensen Huang, whose name adorned the auditorium where I took my first class, Jensen Huang was the head of NVIDIA, and NVIDIA had a lower market share in terms of servers and server revenue than Intel did when I started freshman year. By junior year, Jensen Huang was worth more than the entire company Intel. Right? That's how quickly things change. And NVIDIA, I think, as we all know, is now valued at more than every single pharmaceutical company combined. Right? So all vaccines pale in comparison to the chips. That is allowing a lot of people, I think, on the exterior to make their fortunes in ways that are probably unsavory. Right? That, okay, NVIDIA and maybe OpenAI and Anthropic and Google and Meta and whatnot, like, they'll all be fine, in years to come to some degree. They have something to offer. There will be a correction at some point. There will be. There has been so much money that has flooded the system in a very irresponsible way. There is no way that all of these companies continue to hang on, to survival. So what happens when all of these people who've been hanging around the periphery, making their fortunes without necessarily having to produce revenue or even products, to receive this sort of huge amounts of money, what happens when they all come falling down and it reveals what Silicon Valley has been up to for the last few years? I don't think people on the outside are going to be particularly happy about how this money has been spent.
Your parents are Susan Glasser and Peter Baker, a power couple in political journalism. Glasser of the New Yorker and Baker of the New York Times, just to bring everybody up to speed. I'm sure they're immensely proud of you, but I wonder if they worry about your prospects post-graduation in journalism.
I think they thought they were going to get like the tech kid who was going to give them a retirement fund. Sorry.
You're going to move back in. Yeah.
No, my parents have been great. And, I wanted to go 3,000 miles away from home and be a coder and do something different. But they gave me a fantastic example of what it looks like when people actually live up to their values on a day-by-day basis. They didn't expect this. I didn't expect this. It's been a really weird year. And I remember I came back Thanksgiving break of my freshman year, and I told them for the first time I was working on a story about the president. And I showed them some of the figures that I had identified with the help of Elizabeth Bick and others. And they didn't get it. My dad said, well, you're 17. Like, maybe start with a professor. And there was some sound logic in that, I admit. But they have been fabulously supportive as I've sort of gone off and had this weird time out here.
I'm sure you've noticed at many of your live events that audiences are dominated by people your parents' age and older. What do you tell younger people about the need to support journalism or even participate in it?
Yeah, and books. I just wish people would read more books. Not that I'm alone in that desire. I think journalism, it gets a bad rap these days, but it is a very, very important tool of democracy, of any functioning society, but also like from a business sense too, that you don't want to have people wasting money and spending billions of dollars on frauds. And, the people who tend to be the best at identifying those end up being the investigative journalists. I wish that we would see a more robust ecosystem out here of investigative journalism. I know that there are great people who work at it tirelessly day in and day out, and they're outgunned. In my experience, so many of the stories that I reported on should have been reported years earlier. Should have been. And this is even true of the president, right? One of these studies I report on is this major Alzheimer's study. In 2009, while he was working as a senior executive at Genentech, Mark Tessier-Levine was a senior author on a paper that effectively claimed to have identified the cause of neurodegeneration in Alzheimer's. Right, so this was a huge thing. People have spent decades searching for the cause of this disease. We have not had a really effective treatment yet based on the amyloid hypothesis, even though it's been 30 years of working on that. So in 2009, the world goes crazy for this paper. Every single outlet is writing about it. What I learned in my reporting is that even before that paper came out, internal experiments at Genentech showed that its central finding, this binding between proteins, was at best unreliable. And that 2 years later, an internal review at the company found that it could not be reproduced. The paper could not be reproduced and canceled subsequent research based off of it. Now, 7 people I spoke with at Genentech say that's because the paper was based on fabricated data. Mark Tessier-Levine denies that, to be clear, but he was urged to retract the paper in 2012, and he declined to do so for more than a decade until after my reporting came out, until after his lawyers had tried to stop that reporting from coming out, and it finally did. Here's the thing. Every single newspaper that wrote about that paper in 2009 wrote about this astonishing new theory. They wrote about this incredible new pathway to a treatment, this promise that was being used, by the way, as part of a campaign among Genentech's top stakeholders to increase the price, the purchase price that Roche would pay for their company. It was used as an example of how great their research was and why Roche should pay more to acquire Genentech. Not a single one of those newspapers who wrote about the paper in 2009 followed up and wrote about it when it was finally retracted in 2023, facing credible allegations of research misconduct. Right? And so that's the thing. And I keep coming back to this again and again. With Stanford, with science, with tech, you can't only have the good and forget about the bad.
Tell me a little bit. It might have gotten caught in my spam filter, but I understand you're being dogged throughout this press tour by emails being sent to the people who are doing the interviews.
Yeah, I mean, so Mark Tessier-Lavigne, now that the book is out, we'll see. I saw that he gave some response on stage at a different event last week. But Mark Tessier-Lavigne, we received the first legal threat from his lawyers before a single word of the book was written. And we received the most recent one, less than a week before it was published. We'll see if he actually sues, but certainly he has not been happy about this reporting.
And what is he telling interviewers? Or his people? I mean,
so Mark Tessier-Lavigne, over the course of this reporting, Mark Tessier-Lavigne has hired 3 different PR firms and 2 different law firms to try to go after the reporting in various ways. One of these people was Steve Neal, the chair emeritus of Cooley, which I think is probably familiar to people in the audience as the dominant law firm in many ways of Silicon Valley. Steve Neal, a former counsel to Charles Keating Jr., and then later a counsel to Elizabeth Holmes. Shortly after my 18th birthday, he began sending me letters requesting the retraction of all of my reporting. I'm grateful that we have had a great team behind this book. We've had great lawyers and fact checkers, and we stand by the content of the reporting. But it is unfortunate that Mark Tessier-Lavigne, has never sat for an interview about this. Since my first article came out in November 2022, I have sent over 150 questions in writing and not received an answer to the vast majority of them. Mark Tessier-Lavigne has been offered an interview, a dozen times and has not availed himself of that opportunity. And no one owes anyone an interview, absolutely. But there are a lot of questions here I would still like some answers to, particularly with regard to some of the shifting statements that he made over the course of this reporting. When he at first insisted in his initial defense that these issues had no bearing on the findings or interpretation of these papers. That's a direct quote. When he insisted, in his own words, let me underscore this, the data in the 2009 paper were reproducible, when, of course, Genentech itself has now said that they weren't. I would love to do an interview with Mark Tessier-Lavigne still. I'm not sure that's forthcoming.
We shall see. Who knows? Maybe after this interview. So I thought it would be interesting to have you read a little bit from the tail end of your book, starting with 2 of the VCs leading the investment.
Yeah. So this is just after Mark Tessier-Lavigne has raised $1 billion for his new company.
Mm-hmm.
Tessier-Lavigne debuted Shara on April 23, 2024, with an interview in a friendly industry publication, his first of any kind since November 29, 2022, when my first Stanford Daily article, reporting questions about his research, was published. The matter of his ouster as the president of Stanford was left until 1,400 words into a 1,500-word piece, when the reporter asked him what he'd learned. Tessier-Lavigne said it was important not to take data at face value. Quote, "That's certainly a lesson I've taken to heart," end quote, he said. But was there anything he actually planned to do differently in his next big job? Were there any different controls he would put in place? MTL wouldn't say. 2 of the VCs leading the investment into Tessier-Lavigne's new business turned out to be ones I'd spoken with during my freshman year, the racist one and the money is a rush guy who'd been such a fan of my reporting. And those who read the book, these are characters who appear. Even after announcing their investments in MTL, both of their firms continued to be friendly with me. One invited me to a private event a few months later, with an investor texting me, quote, "Theo, when you aren't knocking university presidents off their perches into the hands of VCs willing to fund them for a B, you should join Winky Face, end quote. Then a partner from the other VC firm reached out, unsolicited, to offer me funding too if I wanted to start a company. I was surprised, but I shouldn't have been. That's how this place works.
Very well put. You should still get the book and read it all the way to the end. If you have questions that you've been jotting down on note cards, this is the time to do it if you haven't, the folks will pass those cards up and let me know about stuff that's happening on YouTube as well, because I just have a couple more questions here. So, number one, what's the buzz about quantum computing on the Stanford campus?
Gosh, I feel like that was like 3 fads ago. I don't know. I mean, that's the other thing, right? There's so many things happening at any given time at Stanford that, it's hard to keep track of it all. Quantum computing, solid state batteries, climate fuel and whatnot. So I haven't heard much on the quantum side in a while.
Yeah, it's been very much eclipsed by the whole AI discussion. Yeah.
Well, look, I think quantum computing is probably a more justifiable spend of money than NFTs ever were, which to me are like, I arrived right at the beginning of the crypto craze, at the zenith of the crypto craze, which was great because we got on campus and I remember sitting, in our convocation and looking around and thinking, well, one of these kids is going to be a billionaire soon, and how are they going to do it? And everyone at first thought it was going to be crypto. A month in, Sam Bankman-Fried comes crashing down to earth, and he's interned, by the way, on the Stanford campus. I learned, actually, that he was supposed to give a lecture to a Stanford tech ethics class that he couldn't give because he was on house arrest like 3 blocks away. And students told me that they wanted to reach the same heights, just not the fall. They thought he was directionally correct, they said.
Oh my gosh.
And there were parties themed after SBF. And, I remember sitting at a dinner hosted by an investor about a few weeks after he comes crashing down. And the kid who's sitting in front of me is one of the biggest crypto boosters on campus. And he says, well, building is halted right now. We're all just trying to figure out legality and how to get around this. How are they going to find their path to fortune? And so 27 days after SBF first comes crashing down, that's when ChatGPT comes out and everything becomes AI. And it was so fascinating to watch because every single person who said they were all about crypto, within a week, they were all about AI.
Oh my goodness. So going back to this question of journalism, where you see it going in the next 5 to 10 years. I mean, in your case, you've got a family that's very supportive, even if it means that they'll be supporting you in their retirement.
Oh, God. That's dark.
But as a representative of your generation, so to speak, how do you imagine, and you can consider this asking for a friend on my part, how do you imagine that journalism stays alive, stays relevant with new generations coming up, makes the case for itself, as it were?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very tough question and a very important one. I am of the belief that journalism is awesome. I know it's not a popular belief, but that is the one that I hold. And I think student journalism in particular is a great example of what journalism can be at its sort of purest form. Because what could be purer than holding your own community to account? And we've seen student journalists across the country doing fabulous work, and I'm so proud to belong to that community because, with no profit incentive and typically with stiff resistance, with lots of harassment and bullying and ostracization just for doing this work, you see teenagers across the country doing amazing stuff. The Crimson, these kids have been killing it day after day, beating out the national press. The Daily Northwestern, broke a story that resulted in the football coach having to step down. The Rice Thresher has been doing awesome work. So, there are student journalists who care about this work, clearly. The problem is the delivery mechanism. We don't have a great way of establishing a sort of news ritual for young people. There's no Cronkite, there's no Sunday paper, even millennials have, blogs and newsletters. Gen Z, my generation, there is no sort of standardized or centralized news intake. It's completely scattered. And traditionally, traditional journalism in that sense, it has many, many issues, but there is something important about independent, nonpartisan media that is reporting without fear or favor. Many of the people that you see on social media regurgitating facts are not doing so with the same incentives aligned toward truth and honesty as the best journalism should be. I don't know how to solve it. I know that the answer is things are really bad right now, and much worse than I think is even clear to people who don't have kids of this age or aren't themselves on campus. I remember running a training for the senior writers at the Stanford Daily in 2023. And these are the kids who are the senior beat reporters, and so they theoretically have the most experience of the people on staff, and they've applied, and they're supposed to write a certain amount. And my icebreaker was, what is the best article of any kind you read in the last week, from any outlet, any publication? And more than half of the people sitting in front of me had not read a single article of any kind in the past week, from any outlet. And these are the journalists, right? So things are pretty bad. I'm hopeful that journalism itself as an institution is not as in terrible shape as people think it is. I do think that the delivery mechanism is really, really suffering at the moment.
Sounds like your next book may need to be a series of social media videos.
Probably more people would read it.
Oy, oy, oy. Well, so let's get into some of these questions. As a high school counselor, a lot of my students see Stanford and its peers as the ultimate prize. What's one specific question these students and parents would ask on a campus tour to understand how a school is teaching students to use power, not just how to get it?
Yeah.
Also, congrats on graduating.
Oh, thank you. Hopefully, fingers crossed. Look, we've created this mythology around these institutions, and Stanford is not alone in this, where we treat them as arbiters of social status, that for some reason we think that, an application reader sitting in a room with 14 minutes in front of something you wrote at 16 or 17 years old can tell everything they need to know about you as a person, right? That it's a value judgment, that you deserve to get in or you don't deserve to. It's a terrible way of looking at these institutions, and it's partly their fault, right? Because they want that exclusivity. They say that they're all about being inclusive, but really they care about being exclusive. I think it's really important for parents and students to understand that a good school is not the end-all and be-all. It's not the goal. It's the starting point, right? That going to a university like Stanford shouldn't be a reward for all your hard work. It's an opportunity that you either use or you don't use. And America has just a fabulous system of higher education, even though it is beset by incredible issues at the moment, affordability being very high up there, but certainly also campus climate and politics and many other issues to boot. And yet, it is still a fabulous thing to be a college student in this country. Maybe more so than anywhere else on earth. The American college model is really special. And wherever you end up going, if you have the chutzpah and you want to go out and ask questions and you want to go and make your own reputation, there's a space to do that.
From a viewer on YouTube, your investigations for your recent Atlantic article and book center around the Stanford Computer Science Department and influence of UCS, I'm thinking. What about other departments?
Yeah. So look, Stanford, as part of this Faustian bargain, we have seen a lot of the parts of a traditional liberal education go by the wayside, right? That as recently as 2008, there were more history majors at Stanford than computer science majors. Now it is 16 times the opposite direction. In fact, there are twice as many faculty in the history department as there are seniors who will graduate with a history degree next month. And so, it's not that these departments have disappeared, and it's not that there is no priority being placed toward them, but it's about the story you tell to the outside world, right, and what you value. And students realize that this is a place that they can get very, very wealthy by falling into the so-called tech whirlpool, and that it's encouraged by the university. That's why there was someone with the moniker Professor Billionaire who made $20 billion by investing in his students' companies, all while being a full-time professor, right? It's completely integrated. Stanford even has its own venture capital firm on campus. It literally runs its own VC fund to seed students as companies, right? And so if you tell students that this is what you value, and this is, the way to get rich, and, there are more opportunities here than in anything else. We've seen the humanities in decline, I guess, across the country, but Stanford is a pretty accelerated version of it.
You've commented on AI's impact on STEM learning. Any thoughts on AI's impact on learning in the humanities?
Well, great segue from the last question. I think attention spans have really suffered. And that's not just AI, that's short-form video. A lot of my friends, the language that they use is really the language of addiction. That they understand is not good for them, but they can't or won't stop. And certainly I've experienced this myself. I think anyone who has used this technology has probably experienced that it's really hard to quit. I think there's actually a pretty good argument to be made that more people are suffering some form of addiction right now than ever before in human history. If you look at the way that we use our devices, try to take an iPhone away from someone for a week, and the average person is going to struggle with that. Might even have some physical response to it. Literally try to take someone's iPhone away from them at dinner the next time you're out for dinner and see if they go clenching for it. Part of what's interesting in seeing that at Stanford, though, is that the very same people who are going off and making their riches, they're doing it by working on the technology that is often worsening the experience for their own peers or former schoolmates, which makes it for this really interesting dynamic because, as you can imagine, there's a whole hell of a lot of jealousy involved when the guy across the hall is raising $1 billion and you can't get a call back from any tech firm.
As a Stanford liberal arts alumni who worked briefly on The Daily, who donates to the university, I am alarmed but not surprised by these developments. Is there any way alumni can help shine a light on these toxic trends?
Yeah. Well, look, I think the most important thing, and the thing that, you can't have anything else without starting here, is having the honest conversation, right? Is having the version of reality that isn't all good or all bad, right? It's not Stanford as picture-perfect, idyllic land where nothing ever goes wrong, nor is it tech is all bad and we should, end the entire industry and nothing good comes out of research at universities. It's understanding that the way that we have set up these incentive structures, the logical end result is for people to cut corners. So until, we reckon with that on sort of a broad scale, and until there's a culture that encourages people to stand up and say, hey, here is something that's gone wrong, and not have them lose their careers and their livelihoods and their acceptance, within social circles because they've had the temerity to stand up and say something is wrong. Until that happens, we're not going to see a lot of change.
A degree in computer science from Stanford and a blockbuster expose leading to a New York Times bestseller. What's next for you? What kind of work do you see yourself being involved in with these talents lying at the intersection of computer science and journalism?
Well, thanks for the flattering question. I'm not sure. I feel like I need to get through graduation first. I think, I really did fall in love with journalism over the course of that year. There's something really cool, right, about being able to be this kid and just asking questions and see where they take you, right? And not being invested in what they show and just being invested in finding out what's there. I think it's more temperament than anything else, journalism. And you can tell me if you think differently, but I've never taken a journalism class, so I don't think it's something you learn. It's not something you learn in the classroom. It's something you learn by doing. It's by showing up at the college party and writing about it, by writing about the college imposter, by writing about the new security cameras on campus. You learn that either you have the temperament or you don't. I think in some way, I will continue to be involved with journalism. I don't know how, but I'm still looking. I'll figure it out.
So you haven't lined up your next book concept yet?
Well, no.
I know there are plenty of writers, fiction and nonfiction, who are like, don't ask me to talk about it. That'll jinx it. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's been really crazy, like being in college and doing 250 interviews for the book and writing it and putting it out and doing my thesis and doing all of these other things and doing it all in 4 years, I haven't had like a lot of time to really sit down and be, aware of where I'm going. But I feel really grateful that I've had the chance to do work that is meaningful to me, and I hope, raises some broader conversations that the community ought to be having.
So let's imagine that you are speaking at a college-level journalism class. You're about to leave the Stanford campus, walk off into the sunset with the tip of the hat. Any hints for who or what these folks might be investigating at Stanford next?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, you never know, right? Stories beget stories. They never come about the way that you think they do, and they're never quite linear. You never get it on the first try. It's, do you keep asking the questions? And then you find something else interesting. And I think we have a tendency as journalists, we talk about the big stories, because those are the ones that matter. But it's the unglamorous ones that set the stage for the big ones. There's no substitute for doing that, and eventually you just stumble into things that are interesting.
Yeah. Well, my goodness gracious. I want to thank Theo Baker, author of How to Rule the World and Education and Power at Stanford University. We encourage you to pick up a copy of Theo's new book here or at your local bookstore. And for information about Commonwealth Club World Affairs membership and upcoming programs, please visit www.commonwealthclub.org. I'm Rachel Myrow. Thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you. Oh my gosh.
This is great.
This is great.